Imagine this scene, a sweltering July morning in 1518, and you're walking through the cobblestone streets of Strasbourg, a prosperous city in the Holy Roman Empire. Merchants are setting up their stalls, children are playing in the squares, and life seems to be going on as usual. But as you turn a corner, you suddenly encounter a sight that freezes your blood. A woman is dancing in the middle of the street. But this is no ordinary dance. This is pure madness. Her movements are completely out of control. Her feet slam against the road, bleeding, her shoes torn apart. Her dress is soaked with sweat, and her face is twisted in pain and desperation as if she's struggling against her own body. And then, the thing that sends a chill down your spine, she cannot stop. No matter how much she begs for mercy, her body continues to move relentlessly. Her name is Frau Troffer, and what you're witnessing is not a normal dance. It is the beginning of a nightmare. A dancing plague that will soon spread, pulling hundreds of people into a maddening frenzy they can't escape. Dozens will die from exhaustion, heart failure, and the simple inability to stop moving. And to this day, 500 years later, we still have no idea why it happened. This is the true story of the dancing plague of 1518, one of the most bizarre and chilling mysteries in human history. Chapter 1. Frau Troffer's Body and Mind. On the morning of July 14, 1518, Frau Troffer, an ordinary woman living in the city of Strasbourg, stepped out of her house into a nightmare that she could neither comprehend nor escape. That moment marked the beginning of an unrelenting horror, one that she would have no control over and no way to stop. The sight of her, a woman dancing wildly in the street, her feet pounding against the stone, bleeding and soaked with sweat, was a terrifying scene that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. But what was truly horrifying was not just the erratic and uncontrollable movements of her body. The most terrifying aspect was the contradiction between Frau Troffer's body and mind. She was not a dancer freely participating in some joyous celebration, but rather a completely helpless victim, consumed by a mysterious frenzy she could not understand and had no control over. Every movement was a desperate struggle between her mind and her body. Although she could feel the intense pain from the wounds caused by her feet striking the hard ground, and the overwhelming fatigue setting in, her body continued to move as though some invisible force had completely taken over her. Frau Troffer's shoes were no longer intact. Blood began to seep from the injuries on her feet, but she seemed oblivious to it. The dance was not one of rhythm or joy, but an erratic, uncontrollable series of movements that appeared completely disconnected from any form of choreography. Her body became a machine of torment, driven by an unseen force, as though it were performing actions outside of her will. Despite her cries, her pleas, her desperate attempts to stop, her body kept moving. There was no way out. She had become trapped in her own body, forced to perform a relentless and horrifying dance, helpless to change the outcome. The most disturbing part was that throughout this entire ordeal, Frau Troffer was fully aware of what was happening. She could feel the pain, the exhaustion, and the despair of not being able to stop, yet her body simply wouldn't obey. It wasn't just physical suffering, it was the mental anguish of being fully conscious, fully aware of the torment she was enduring, but completely powerless to end it. This disconnect between mind and body was a form of torture unlike anything imaginable. Each movement, each erratic gesture was a reminder of how her mind could no longer control her own physical being. Frau Troffer's struggle was not just a physical one, it was also a psychological one. She was trapped in an ongoing nightmare, forced to witness the destruction of her own body, yet unable to intervene. She could hear the crowds gathering around her, could feel the eyes of the onlookers, but still she had no control. She could feel the agony as her legs twisted and her body jerked involuntarily, but she was powerless to stop it. Even when neighbors approached to offer help, all she could do was push them away, as though some invisible fear held her in its grip, preventing her from receiving any assistance. Her gaze was not that of a dancer enjoying the rhythm, but of someone caught in an unbearable torment, someone witnessing the destruction of their body while being completely unable to stop it. This sense of being trapped, unable to control her own actions, must have been an unbearable mental burden. It was not only a physical battle, but a psychological one, a horrifying experience of losing control over the most basic functions of the body. As the hours stretched on and the dance continued, Fra Troffa's mind must have been consumed by the desperate wish for the nightmare to end, even though she knew there was no escape. Her body was no longer her own, and the terror of being forced to continue against her will became an even greater torment than the physical exhaustion itself. In that moment, Fra Troffa had become a prisoner of her own body, not just physically, but psychologically as well. Her body had turned against her, performing movements that made no sense, while her mind remained fully aware of the devastation unfolding before her. The more she tried to fight it, the more her body seemed to rebel, and the more hopeless she must have felt. It was a terrifying ordeal, one that destroyed not just the body, but the spirit. She was trapped in a torment of her own making, with no way to stop the relentless dance that held her captive. Chapter 2. The Spread of the Dancing Plague. What began as a single terrifying incident quickly spiraled into something far more monstrous. The first few hours of Fra Troffa's uncontrollable dance were only the beginning of a horrifying phenomenon that would soon consume the entire city of Strasbourg. As word of her strange behavior spread, something insidious began to take hold of the population, an invisible force compelling others to join in her frenzied movements. By the second day, the curse of the dance had already taken its toll on one more person. A neighbor, Klaus, who had witnessed Fra Troffa's agonizing display. At first, it was just a mild twitching in his legs, a restless energy that made sitting still unbearable. But as hours passed, the compulsion grew stronger, an overwhelming urge to move that he could not resist. Klaus found himself trapped, unable to stop, his body taken over by the same uncontrollable rhythm that had possessed Fra Troffa. But unlike her chaotic thrashing, Klaus's movements were more structured, as though he was performing a waltz with invisible partners. His arms moving in perfect positions as if holding someone, spinning and stepping to an invisible melody only he could hear. As Klaus's dance joined Fra Troffa's chaotic frenzy, something strange happened. The crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle grew larger. The sight of two people caught in the same inexplicable affliction sparked a mixture of curiosity and fear among the townspeople. Some whispered it was a divine punishment, others murmured that the devil had come to claim them, while a few believed the dancers were cursed by witchcraft. But no matter the cause, the fact remained. The dancing plague had begun to spread. By the third day, the number of dancers had grown from 2 to 6. And with each passing hour, more and more people joined, as if they could not help but mirror the movements of those already dancing. There were no patterns, no common threads between the various forms of the dance. Some danced violently like Fra Troffa, their bodies jerking and twisting in uncontrollable spasms. Others swayed and spun, moving gracefully as though waltzing, much like Klaus. A few moved in military-like steps, as if marching to an unseen drumbeat, their arms raised as though saluting an invisible commander. There were those who danced as if they were at a peasant festival, clapping their hands and stomping their feet in folk rhythms. What united them all was not the style of dance, but the terrifying inability to stop. The same horrified expression appeared on each of their faces, eyes wide with panic, bodies exhausted, but still compelled to keep moving. And as the number of dancers swelled to over 30 by the end of the first week, it became clear that this was no ordinary contagion. It wasn't just a physical condition, it was a sickness of the mind, spreading from one person to another like wildfire. The most unnerving part of this entire event was the way the plague spread. It wasn't random. It seemed to have a pattern, an almost purposeful flow. Those who watched the dancers for an extended period were far more likely to join in the frenzied movement. Families who were caring for affected loved ones often found themselves inexplicably drawn into the dance, one by one, until entire households were caught in the grip of the madness. It was as though the very act of witnessing the dance triggered something in the viewer, something deep within the psyche, compelling them to partake in the same uncontrollable motion. Dr. Jan Weyer, a physician who happened to be visiting Strasbourg at the time, documented the phenomenon in his journal, writing, "I have seen plagues of the body that destroy flesh and bone, but this is a plague of the soul, spreading from eye to mind to limb, turning rational human beings into slaves of motion they cannot comprehend or control." And in this chilling observation, Dr. Weyer captured the essence of what made this epidemic so terrifying. It wasn't just the body that was affected, but the very mind itself. A disease of the spirit, a sickness of the soul, spread not through physical contact or contagion, but through sight, through witnessing the behavior of another, and somehow absorbing it into one's own being. As the days passed, the epidemic grew ever more catastrophic. The streets of Strasbourg were filled with dancers, their movements erratic and endless. The spectacle was both horrific and mesmerizing, drawing crowds of onlookers, each one at risk of being drawn into the madness themselves. And yet, despite the growing number of afflicted, no one could explain why this was happening or how it could be stopped. The city was helpless, caught in a nightmare of its own making, with no escape in sight. Chapter 3. The city's response. As the dancing plague spread, the people of Strasbourg, already frightened and confused, now found themselves facing not just a bizarre phenomenon, but a public catastrophe. In front of them were dozens of people unable to stop their erratic, chaotic dancing, a sight that no one could explain. The city's authorities, a mix of officials, physicians, and clergy, quickly realized they needed to act before the situation escalated into something even worse. However, in a time when science and medicine were still developing, their decision would prove to be one of the most disastrously wrong responses in recorded history. With no plausible scientific explanation, the city officials turned to religious leaders and theologians for guidance, hoping they would have some insight into the cause of the strange affliction. The clergy believed the dancers were possessed by demonic forces or cursed by a divine punishment. Those afflicted were seen as being under the control of supernatural powers, and the only solution was to expel these forces through religious rites, even performing exorcisms. Yet these attempts had no effect. With no scientific or logical explanation for what was happening, the authorities decided to try a truly bizarre method of treatment, to allow the dancers to keep dancing. They believed the affected people were suffering from hot blood or overexcitement, and that the only cure would be for them to dance until they had exhausted themselves. According to the medical understanding of the time, the condition would end once they had sweated out the humors in their bodies. This theory was based on the popular belief that exercise would relieve the body of excess heat. The city council hired professional musicians to play music, and they set up a large wooden stage in the town square, hoping that the presence of healthy dancers would help guide the afflicted ones and bring their movements under control. They even invited dancers from neighboring towns to demonstrate the proper way to dance, thinking that showing the correct rhythm would somehow bring the suffering to an end. However, this plan did not just fail, it made the situation worse. The addition of music and professional dancers seemed to amplify the compulsion to dance. What had been chaotic, uncontrollable movements now became more synchronized, more violent, and far more dangerous. The dancers, who had previously been moving in their own uncoordinated way, now moved in unison with the rhythm of the music. But the intensity of the movement increased, and the frenzy deepened. The professional dancers who came to help found themselves unable to leave the stage, slowly becoming just as trapped as the original victims. The city, once a thriving and peaceful place, now felt like a scene from Dante's Inferno. The town square became a hellish arena where the afflicted danced endlessly, surrounded by musicians who could not stop playing, terrified that the dancers would become even more violent if they did. As the crowd grew larger, more people were drawn into the madness. More people began to join the dance, and soon the number of infected dancers swelled from 30 to over 100. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Strasbourg had become trapped in its own nightmare with no escape in sight. The city's response, which was meant to help the afflicted, had only fueled the fire. It was a grim reminder of how ignorance and the lack of medical knowledge in the past could exacerbate a crisis. The city's authorities, unable to understand the true nature of the plague, ended up making the problem far worse. What began as a local curiosity turned into a full-scale public health disaster, and the city was helpless to stop it. Chapter 4. The escalating crisis and its consequences. As the dancing plague continued to spread, it became clear that the city of Strasbourg was not just dealing with a physical affliction, but with something that was fundamentally beyond their understanding. The more the authorities tried to treat the condition with music and dance, the more the situation escalated. The town square, once a lively hub of activity, had now become a nightmarish spectacle. The sound of hundreds of feet stamping, the frantic music played by an ever-growing group of musicians, and the constant cries of exhaustion filled the air, creating an atmosphere of complete hysteria. What was initially seen as an odd curiosity had now become a full-blown epidemic. The streets were flooded with people in an uncontrollable dance. The most disturbing part was the way the contagion spread. People who had witnessed the dancers for any length of time found themselves unable to resist the compulsion to join in. It was as if the very act of watching the dancers turned them into unwilling participants. Friends, family members, and even complete strangers were drawn into the dance without explanation. The more people who watched, the more people who danced. It was a psychological contagion, a mass hysteria that had taken hold of an entire city. And as the epidemic continued, so did the suffering. The death toll began to rise. The first deaths occurred after about a week, as those who had danced the longest began to collapse from sheer exhaustion. Fra Troffa, the first victim, was one of the first to die. Her body finally gave out after days of continuous motion. She collapsed mid-spin, her body too weak to continue. Witnesses described her final moments as a tragic mix of desperation and exhaustion, her body jerking uncontrollably even after she had lost consciousness, as if the compulsion to move was stronger than life itself. Her death, though tragic, was only the beginning. The dancers who survived continued to suffer physically. Some died from heart failure, their bodies unable to keep up with the extreme exertion. Others succumbed to strokes, their bodies unable to maintain the balance between movement and rest. Perhaps the most disturbing were the cases where people simply gave up. These dancers continued to move, but their eyes glazed over, their faces losing all expression. They were, in essence, walking corpses, trapped in a mechanical dance until their bodies finally shut down. Medical records from the time describe the horrendous physical toll on the dancers: feet worn down to bloody stumps, joints dislocated from the relentless movements, and muscles that had essentially consumed themselves from overuse. The very act of dancing had become a form of self-destruction. As the days dragged on, the city began to descend into chaos. Businesses closed, as workers became too affected or too fearful to work. The economy ground to a halt, and families fled in terror, leaving behind empty houses and abandoned neighborhoods. Even those who were not afflicted by the dance became afraid to leave their homes. The atmosphere was thick with fear, and the city's leaders, having no understanding of what was happening, were powerless to stop it. The streets of Strasbourg, once bustling with trade and life, were now a shadow of their former selves, haunted by the sounds of frantic dancing and the desperate cries of the afflicted. The death toll continued to climb, and the city's already fragile social fabric began to disintegrate. People had been pushed to the edge, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The strain of living through such a crisis was too much for many to bear, and the long-term consequences would haunt Strasbourg for years to come. As more and more people died, the once thriving city found itself depleted of its young and able-bodied citizens, with entire families wiped out or driven to flee in search of safety. The medieval world, with its limited understanding of psychology and medicine, was ill-equipped to handle such an epidemic. The authorities, in their desperation, had resorted to unscientific measures that not only failed to alleviate the problem, but actually made it worse. What had started as a localized affliction quickly spiraled out of control, becoming one of the most bizarre and catastrophic events in European history. And in the wake of this devastating epidemic, the city of Strasbourg would never be the same again. The survivors, both physically and psychologically scarred, would carry the trauma of the event for the rest of their lives. The city itself, having lost a significant portion of its population, would take years, if not decades, to recover. The memory of the dancing plague would linger in the collective consciousness, a chilling reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the terrifying power of mass hysteria. Chapter 5. The Aftermath and Long-Term Effects. By the end of July 1518, the city of Strasbourg was unrecognizable. The dancing plague, which had started with just one woman, had claimed the lives of dozens and left hundreds of others permanently scarred. It was no longer just an isolated event. It had become an indelible part of the city's history. leaving behind physical and psychological wounds that would never truly heal. For the survivors, the trauma was both physical and mental. Those who had danced for days on end suffered severe health complications. Many were left with permanent disabilities, joints dislocated or damaged beyond repair, feet mutilated by hours of frenzied movement, and muscles that had been irreparably damaged by the unrelenting exercise. The long-term effects of such a violent, uncontrolled event were not immediately understood, but the physical toll was undeniable. Survivors were left with lifelong pain, some unable to walk normally ever again. The economy of Strasbourg, already strained, was now in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been abandoned as families fled in terror, seeking refuge in nearby towns, but many never returned. But perhaps the most devastating impact was on the mental health of the survivors. Those who had witnessed the plague or been caught up in it often suffered from deep psychological trauma. Survivors reported feelings of having lost their sense of self. They described being conscious during their ordeal, aware of their movements and the chaos around them, but utterly powerless to stop the compulsion to dance. This feeling of being trapped in their own bodies haunted them for years. Some survivors were unable to cope with the psychological scars left by the experience. They struggled with anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, symptoms that modern psychiatry would later come to understand, but that were completely unrecognized at the time. The fear of music or rhythmic sounds became a common thread among those who had survived the plague. Many could no longer bear the sound of music without feeling a deep sense of panic. The once joyful sounds of dancing had now become linked to a horrific period of their lives, and for many, the thought of moving to the beat of a drum or a song became unbearable. Those who had danced with uncontrollable fury now lived in terror of anything that might trigger a relapse. The city of Strasbourg, meanwhile, struggled to recover. The trauma of the event lingered in the collective memory of its residents. Public dancing was banned for years, except for specific religious festivals. Street musicians were required to obtain special permits, and those who played music that was deemed too rhythmic or compelling risked being arrested. Even the stage that had been built in the town square in an attempt to cure the plague was burned down, and the square itself was consecrated to prevent any future outbreaks. The economic and social damage was profound. Strasbourg lost nearly 15% of its adult population to death, disability, or migration. Entire families were wiped out, and the city was left with a skeleton crew of survivors, many of whom were too physically or mentally scarred to contribute to the rebuilding effort. It took over a decade for the city to regain any semblance of the prosperity it once enjoyed. The memory of the plague was so strong that the event cast a long shadow over the city for years to come. The spread of fear and fascination across Europe. Word of the dancing plague spread quickly beyond Strasbourg, and it inspired both fear and fascination throughout Europe. Other cities began to report similar outbreaks, though none on the same scale. Smaller, localized instances of dancing mania were recorded in places like Aachen, Basel, and other parts of the Holy Roman Empire. But none of these events had the same devastating impact as the one in Strasbourg. The outbreak in Strasbourg became a cautionary tale that would be discussed in medical and theological circles for centuries to come. It would inspire a mix of theories, from religious explanations of divine punishment to medical theories that sought to understand the phenomenon in terms of psychology or infection. But despite these theories, no one was ever able to fully explain what happened in 1518. Theories and modern interpretations. As time passed, numerous theories were proposed to explain the dancing plague. In the medieval world, religious authorities had attributed the plague to demonic possession or divine wrath, and some even called for the execution of witches whom they believed were responsible for the curse. The idea that the dancers were cursed or possessed by spirits was widespread, and some authorities pushed for mass witch hunts as a solution. Medieval physicians also offered their own explanations. One of the most common theories was that the dancers were suffering from hot blood, a medieval understanding of a physical imbalance that supposedly could only be cured by physical exertion, such as continuous dancing. Others suggested that the plague was caused by ergot poisoning from contaminated rye bread, which could lead to hallucinations, convulsions, and uncontrollable movements. But the ergot theory was never fully accepted, as it could not explain why the epidemic spread so quickly through social contagion. Only those who watched or were near the dancers were likely to catch the affliction, not those who shared the same food source. Modern medical and psychological research offers more sophisticated explanations. One theory is that the plague was a form of mass psychogenic illness, a psychological phenomenon in which a group of people experiences similar physical symptoms due to stress, anxiety, or social pressures. Strasbourg in 1518 had recently suffered from famine, disease, and political instability, which created an environment ripe for such a psychological breakdown. The dancers may have been unconsciously expressing their stress and despair through movement, which spread rapidly through the social network of the city. Another theory points to the possibility of encephalitis lethargica, sleeping sickness, a viral infection that can cause neurological symptoms, including compulsive movement disorders. While the disease was not well known at the time, some researchers believe that it could explain the bizarre behavior of the dancers. A warning for the modern world. Despite the centuries that have passed since the dancing plague of 1518, the event remains a striking example of how the human mind can be affected by social pressures and extreme stress. Today, in an era of social media, mass hysteria, and viral challenges, the phenomenon of social contagion is more relevant than ever. We live in a world where ideas, behaviors, and emotions can spread like wildfire through online platforms, often leading to real-world consequences. From the spread of dangerous social media trends to the rapid escalation of conspiracy theories, the lessons of Strasbourg's dancing plague still resonate. The citizens of Strasbourg in 1518 could not understand why they were afflicted. They could not explain why one woman's uncontrollable dance turned into a citywide epidemic. Today, while we may have a better understanding of psychology and medical conditions, the same forces of social contagion that gripped Strasbourg remain at play in our modern world. And just as the people of Strasbourg were powerless against the mysterious affliction, so too are we vulnerable to the unseen forces that shape our thoughts, behaviors, and actions. In the end, the dancing plague serves as both a historical curiosity and a modern warning. It reminds us of the fragility of the human mind, the power of collective behavior, and the dangers of social contagion. We may have more tools to understand the world today, but the story of the dancing plague shows us that there are still mysteries about human nature that we have yet to fully comprehend.